how Haiti got so good at smoking French soldiers from GDF.
The following is an excerpt from the 4th volume of The History, Civil and Commercial of the British Colonies in the West Indies, though its author Brian Edwards is speaking of the French colony of Saint-Domingue. The rebellion first broke out on a plantation called Noe, 9 miles only from the city. 12 or 14 of the ringleaders, about the middle of the night, proceeded to the refinery or sugar house and seized on a young man, the refiner's apprentice.
No, this video is not AI, man. It's GDF, GDF official. I literally fucking promote him all the time. How do people not know this?
Dragged him to the front of the dwelling house, and there hewed him into pieces with their cutlasses. His screams brought out the overseer, whom they instantly shot. The rebels now found their way to the apartment of the refiner and massacred him in his bed. These rebels, as Edwards describes them, made their way from there to the house of a Mr. Clement, where both he and his refiner were massacred. Then on to the plantation of a Mr. Flaville, just a few miles away, where they likewise rose and murdered 5 white persons. The approach of daylight served only to discover sights of horror. It was now apparent that the slaves on all the estates in the plain acted in concert, and a general massacre of the whites took place in every quarter. After some time, though, according to Edwards' account, the ruffians exchanged the sword for the torch. The buildings and cane fields were everywhere set on fire, and the conflagrations, which were visible from the town in 1,000 different quarters, furnished a prospect more shocking and reflections more dismal than fancy can paint or the powers of man describe. The night of August 22nd of the year 1791 was one of incredible violence. It was the night that a revolt of slaves of the French colony of Saint-Domingue began in earnest and quickly gained great ferocity. The principal difference with this particular slave revolt was that it can boast being the only successful one in history. It ultimately created the first nation to banish slavery, and further, the first black nation, the nation of what is now called Haiti. Like any responsible student of history, it is critical in understanding the actions of August of 1791 to examine the context that preceded it. It would hardly be fair to begin the story merely with what occurred in August of 1791, now wouldn't it? Indeed, the events which preceded August of 1791 provide important insight into the motivations of the rebels, a fact that is obvious to all of us now, given the hundreds of years, the degrees of separation that allow for clarity, and not judgments based on emotion and political biases. No.
I wonder why he's drawing a parallel here.
Given what preceded August of 1791, it is self-evident that the slaves of Saint-Domingue had very real grievances, and that their cause was not only just, but moral. The story, in the way that I'd like to tell it, begins in 1493. This was the year of Christopher Columbus's second
lib saying this is a Nazi channel? No, definitely not.
Voyage to the Americas, in which he revisited the island that would be called Hispaniola. Before long, the indigenous Taino people would be virtually wiped out, according to genocide scholar David Stannard. Just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populated island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. A consequence of not only disease, according to Stannard, but also murderous exhibitions by Spanish troops beginning in March of 1495. Besides disease and slaughter, another crucial import was introduced by Columbus, one that would cement the legacy of Hispaniola for generations to come: sugar. It was this maneuver which helped make Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, a nation comprising the western third of the island of Hispaniola, into the single main destination of the Atlantic slave trade by the late 1780s. Saint-Domingue was what the French would name their colony, which they settled in the early 17th century, taking their name from the island's capital, Santo Domingo. Saint-Domingue's wealth was staggering. No bigger than the U.S. state of Vermont, it was a powerhouse of the Atlantic economy.
Did you know that so many people were killed as a result of the colonization of the Americas that global temperatures actually fell? I did not know that. Holy fuck. Really? Damn.
Whose exports exceeded those of the United States and were worth more than those of Brazil and Mexico combined. The island produced more sugar and more coffee than anywhere else in the world, and with this immense amount of trade, the tax revenue from this small piece of land alone funded the entire French Navy. Saint-Domingue was a fast-living colony where white Frenchmen sought to get rich quick, working up the slave economy's hierarchy of overseers, plantation attorneys, and ultimately owners, who could comfortably live in absentia in France while their administrators handled the day-to-day. Indeed, Saint-Domingue was home to about 30,000 white colonists, and, as men outnumbered women 3-to-1 among white colonists, interracial unions ranging from the ephemeral and sordid to the occasional marriage gave rise to a large population of mixed racial descent. Their descendants were free, and along with their ex-slave counterparts, free people of color made up another tranche of about 30,000 of the population, roughly equivalent to the white colonists. Yeah. As for slaves, their population was enormous.
When he says free people of color, he means the Polish. I'm just kidding. Okay, sorry.
Slave traders shipped more than 200,000 Africans to Saint-Domingue in the 1780s alone. On the eve of the Revolution, there were about as many slaves in Saint-Domingue than in the entire American South, nearly 500,000 in all, making up 90% of the population. Control was maintained, as was the entire system of slavery, through violence. Punishments were cruel.
r/Poland's going to get mad again? Why? This is like an objective W for the Polish history. If they get mad at this, they're just, oh, fuck, they are very stupid over there at r/Poland. Shit. They won't understand that I'm saying like they played a role in the on the right side of history here.
And went unpunished. Slaves, after all, were property by law. Exhibitionist whippings were as much intended to terrorize other slaves as they were to torture their victims. French historian Pierre de Vassières gave gut-wrenching detail of slave reprisals in his history of Saint-Domingue. Pepper, salt, lemon, ashes, quicklime would be poured into open whip wounds. Or perhaps gunpowder would be placed inside their rectum, which was lit with a wick. There are, I assure you, many other atrocities to speak of, far, far worse than what I've just described. Even absent these indignities, slaves had been ferried from their homeland under the deck of a slave ship in the most horrid conditions imaginable. This was their introduction to life in Saint-Domingue. Upon arrival, they were branded as though they were livestock, and each time they were sold thereafter, they were branded again and again. They worked sun up to sundown, 6 days a week, or if they were on the sugar plantations, into the night as well.
I think this is important to understand so that the rest of the video, which is going to talk about the the slaughter, because it basically gives you the moral basis of what the brutality looked like and why the brutality looked the way that it did. It's just offering you context and a moral justification for it.
Digging canals, tilling, planting, harvesting. A Swiss traveler named Giraud Chantrant spent a year in northern Saint-Domingue in the early 1780s. He provides valuable insight into slave life free from French colonial bias. On a large, well-managed sugar plantation, the work never stops. Either the ripened canes need to be cut or a field needs replanting after being harvested. Tired by the heat and the weight of their pickaxes, and by a heavy soil baked hard enough to break their tools.
For those of you who don't know, this played a ginormous role in the collectivization efforts of the Western world. This plays a fundamental role in why the Western world became so bountiful. Okay? It continues under different names to this day, but like this established the basis for it. Okay?
They made great efforts to overcome every obstacle. A gloomy silence reigned among them. Pain was visible on every face, but the hour of rest never came. The manager watched the working without pity, and several slave drivers armed with long whips mixed in.
You're not going to try and say this is something we can compare to a current event happening? Wait, what? I already did.
Among the workers, dealt out harsh blows, men and women, young and old, without distinction. This European gentleman himself couldn't help but express his disgust at the condition of the slaves.
And you remember Vauch's Haitian Revolution was white genocide era? No, because I only see his high notes and none of his low notes, because I only know things that he says about like dropping tactical N-words, for example, or Tacoma wept, or excuse me for my shared presumed knowledge of goblin porn. Those are the fun stuff, and not like the really, really bad shit.
Could a European fresh from the charming countryside of Switzerland gaze on that of Saint-Domingue without getting angry? At the debasement of the men used here, their suffering and extreme poverty? At the enormous chains they have to drag around if they commit a small fault, as if their daily work is not already exhausting enough? The powers in Paris had in fact done nothing to improve the lot of the slaves, and were not about to, but that would change once the slaves took action on their own. On the evening of August 14th of the year 1791, great numbers of slaves, many acting as delegates for their plantations, convened a meeting in the woods of Bois Caïman. The ceremony was led by a slave named Boukman. Duddy Boukman, as he was called, would emerge as the first leader of the rebellion. Their spiritual leader, Boukman, was a voodoo priest. Voodoo's contribution to the revolution remains controversial, but it assuredly included grassroots organization, a sense of solidarity, and of invulnerability in combat, and leadership at different levels. At the ceremony, Boukman was quoted as saying, among other things, the following: "Throw away the image of the God of the whites, who thirst for our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty that speaks in the hearts of all of us." Thereafter, the participants of the meeting swore an oath of secrecy and revenge. The pact would be sealed by the sacrificial slaughter of a pig, whose blood was drank by the attendees. The plan that they had made required careful coordination among large numbers of slaves, who were to rise up and start the burning and killing in unison. The date set for the event was, as best we can tell, the night of Wednesday, August 24th. Perhaps unable to contain themselves, the events which unfolded at the Noe plantation occurred 2 days early. Plundering masters' homes, destroying the infrastructure of the plantations on which they were enslaved, and killing those who had enslaved them were powerful ways to pursue liberty. Indeed, they were the only ways available to most of the slaves. We can only imagine the exuberance and exhilaration the rebels must have felt as they took vengeance, turned the tables on their masters, and saw, perhaps for the first time, the extent of their power.
So one thing to always remember is that the colonizing entity, right, the oppressive entity, whether it's chattel slavery or let's say a settler colonial ethno-nationalist apartheid state, right? Just throwing that out there. They set the standard for violence, right? It is their violent means that inevitably require equally proportionate, as to the best of their ability, violent resistance. So that's something to always remember, okay? That's it. And you can maybe even track that throughout the history of, I don't know, let's say Palestinian resistance. Okay? I don't know why I came up with that just now. I don't know why it's in my mind for some reason. But like Palestinian resistance throughout history has taken many different forms. Okay? It is just simply that its final most well covered and well documented inception of it was brutal. Okay? There were atrocities. It is because the standard of violence has reached that level of atrocity in the daily existence of those who are colonized, those who are oppressed, those who are victims of the violent ethno-nationalist rule. If you understand, it is It is usually, yes, it is usually an act of desperation because ultimately no one wants to fucking be violent. Like, think about your lifestyle. Think about the way you exist in the world right now. You have a very comfortable life, right? If you're on Twitch, you most likely have a very comfortable life in comparison to what we are talking about here. Like, obviously, a enslaved person in Haiti, definitely in comparison to that, you have a very comfortable life. So violence is completely removed from the equation for you in the way that you resist to oppressive constructs. That's why you do like civil disobedience every now and then. You know, you shut off a speaking engagement. You protest the Oscars, things of that nature. Now, if the standard of violence in your everyday existence was up to, I don't know, let's say Gaza, right? Where your housing is being pummeled into oblivion by American rockets, by American missiles on a daily fucking basis. Half of your family is dead. You watched, the sinewy, their sinewy bodies fucking hanging from the ledge of a building that recently turned into a fucking crater. You're going to probably want to resort to a violent means of resistance against those who are responsible for that. Perfectly understandable.
Of course, it was only a matter of time before a counteroffensive was launched, a fact undoubtedly known to all of the rebels. They proved themselves to be a worthy and terrifying adversary. Let us turn our attention back to Brian Edwards' testimony, where he details the utter carnage of the revolt period, what he calls an exterminating war.
It seems like religious lies make people violent too. Yeah, totally. It's the voodoo that caused the Haitian revolution to be so violent, and not the fact that they were fucking enslaved and had gunpowder shoved into their asses and lit on fire by whips. You know, who's to say which one played a bigger role here? No, man, this is why the whole r/atheism conversation is so fucking stupid. Okay? Religion is just a galvanizing principle. It's just a factor in the equation. It can be used for liberation in the abolition of slavery in the United States of America, as a matter of fact. Liberation theology played a role. Liberation theology also played a role in the civil rights movement. Okay? Religion, on the other hand, Christianity specifically, also played a formative role in the defense of white supremacist chattel slavery. This fact alone should cause you to, I don't know, second guess or maybe reconsider, the importance of religion in this, beyond just simply being a principal motivator. It gets people together. It's something you can use.
Within 2 months after the revolt began, upwards of 2,000 white persons of all conditions and ages had been massacred. 180 sugar plantations and about 900 coffee, cotton, and indigo settlements had been destroyed, the buildings therein being consumed by fire. Of the insurgents, it was reckoned that upwards of 10,000 had perished by the sword or by famine, and some hundreds by the hands of the executioner, many of them, I am sorry to say, under the torture of the wheel, a system of revenge and retaliation which no enormities of savage life could justify or excuse. Edwards was referring to the practice known as breaking at the wheel, where an unlucky victim is tied to a scaffold, perhaps a wagon wheel, and beaten to death, typically as painfully as possible by targeting limbs and joints. Edwards' opinion that there was no excuse for such a brutal practice was informed by him witnessing 2 men being executed in this way. 2 of these unhappy men suffered in this manner under the window of the author's lodgings and in his presence at Cap Francois on Thursday, the 18th of September, 1791. They were broken on 2 pieces of timber placed crosswise. One of them expired on receiving the 3rd stroke on his stomach, each of his legs and arms having been first broken in 2 places. The first 3 blows he bore without a groan. The other had a harder fate. When the executioner, after breaking his legs and arms, lifted up the instrument to give the finishing stroke on the breast, and which, by putting the criminal out of his pain, is called le coup de grâce, the mob, with the ferociousness of cannibals, called out "Arrêtez" and compelled him to leave his work unfinished. In that condition, the miserable wretch, with his broken limbs doubled up, was put on a cartwheel, which was placed horizontally, one end of the axle being driven into the earth. He seemed perfectly sensible, but uttered not a groan. At the end of 40 minutes, some English seamen, who were spectators of the tragedy, strangled him in mercy. A Captain Bickford of Salem, Massachusetts, a witness to the early days of the Revolution, was quoted at the time in the Philadelphia General Advertiser. "The country is filled with dead bodies, which lie unburied. The slaves have left the whites with stakes driven through them into the ground, and the white troops, who now take no prisoners, but kill everything black or yellow, leave the slaves dead upon the field." Though despite these brutal measures, the rebels held their own. Indeed, the French appear to have been experiencing an all too familiar problem that would plague all occupying and colonial powers throughout history, that of the enduring guerrilla. In the words of a Madame de Rouvray, "We kill many of them, and they seem to reproduce themselves out of their ashes." They were armed with guns, knives, sticks, and all the sharp utensils of kitchen and of farm. Some were nude, some in tatters, and some grotesquely decked in the rich apparel taken from our wardrobes. They had, as artillery, 15 cannon taken from our villages. Over time, the rebel slaves came to acquire more arms, until they became well armed with muskets and swords. They organized themselves into regular bodies. They made liberal use of hit-and-run, ambush attacks, and psychological warfare. This has been attributed to a crucial fact about the rebel slaves. On the eve of the Revolution, of the 500,000 slaves in Saint-Domingue, 2/3 of them were not only black, they were born in Africa. These were enslaved prisoners of war, and by 1791, only a minority of French troops had ever actually seen combat before. The Africans, diverse in their backgrounds, speaking up to a dozen languages in a single plantation, were a lot alike in this regard. The French as well, up to that point, certainly were not trained in guerrilla warfare and were not privy to many of its central tenets. European armies were only just beginning to learn backwoods practices like firing from behind cover or in a prone position, and scattering instead of standing upright when being shot at. With ambushes, psychological warfare, and hit-and-run tactics, the insurgents compensated for their lack of firearms. They never fought out in the open or bunched together. 1,000 blacks would never confront 100 whites in open country, but they would advance making a terrible noise at first, though after having got quite close to their enemy, but still out of range, they would fall completely silent. They distributed their troops by platoons in all the overgrown places, so that they seemed 6 times more numerous than they really were. The bravery of these Africans is unbelievable. One fascinating letter from a 16-year-old French girl to her American stepmother describes how her own father came under a rebel assault.
The parallels are quite obvious. When you are used to fighting against dudes who do not have superior firepower to you, who don't have any weapons at all, you get used to not even looking for cover because you're killing mostly civilians. So when you actually encounter an enemy that fights back, you then quickly recognize maybe I do have to stand behind cover.
Papa left last Monday with 300 men of the National Guard. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Papa was attacked. Some of the guardsmen throwed themselves in the sea. Papa's guide, a black man, was pulling them out by the feet and crying, "Get a hold of yourselves." Some have horns, others have broken kettles, and they try to make as much noise as possible in order to confuse and frighten whites. Papa says that it was impossible to hear oneself. Finally, on the 29th of August of the year 1793, 1 year and 1 week after the Slave Rebellion, a landmark proclamation was issued by Commissioner Léger Félicité Sontonax, the world's first
Or if they weren't fighting against like civilians, they weren't slaughtering civilians, they were fighting against other standing armies. And the conventional methods of warfare at the time required literally fucking basically doing the same shit that they were doing in like the Legionnaire era almost, of just having a shit ton of people stand in a line and shoot against another shit ton of people. It's so funny when you learn about like the history of warfare, where the first guy that comes up with like flanking, for example, is like regarded as a massive, brilliant guy. All things that we obviously take for granted now. But it's literally like somewhere along the line, somebody invented flanking. You know what I mean? And the first guy that did it, everyone was like, oh my God, how did this fucking happen?
Abolition of slavery, and the only one in response to
Hannibal did that, was nuking the Romans, is crazy.
slave rebellion, a landmark in the history of the Americas. In doing so, the French acquired an important ally, one who would radically alter the course of not only the history of Haiti, but the history of the world.
Yeah, I love that the art of war is like attack your enemies at night and humans do not like fire. And it is seen as genius text. I mean, for the time, it was genius.
I am Toussaint Louverture. My name is perhaps known to you. I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue. When he joined the resistance in 1791, Toussaint Louverture was already a free man. According to Louverture's son Isaac, who became an important source of information on his life, Toussaint was born in 1746, the grandson of an Arada prince. He was born Toussaint Preda, after the slaveholding family that owned him. Fortunately for him, by 1776, Toussaint was emancipated. After leaving the Preda plantation, Toussaint adopted the name Louverture, meaning the opening. Its origins are disputed, though perhaps it denoted his newfound role as a freedom fighter. Toussaint's loyalties at the onset of the Revolution were understandably not with the French forces. He would eventually join the Spanish, who had declared war on France in 1792. Hispaniola would soon become swarming with colonial armies, for as a result of the ongoing French Revolution, King Louis XVI was executed, and the Republicans declared war on England. France, Spain, and now England all wanted a peace. Though after the abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue, or
Many of you should declare a war on the top of the hour ad break, though, honestly. And destroy the top of the hour ad break by subscribing for $5 or for free 2 in a row. It's like kind of shitty.
after Toussaint had laid eyes directly on the proclamation, not wanting to leave anything to hearsay, Louverture would join France and become a formidable ally. It wouldn't be long until Spain sued for peace with France in 1795, and after waging a ruthless campaign against the remaining British, Toussaint Louverture had successfully expelled them by 1798. Having defeated all of his colonial rivals, Toussaint became Governor-General of Saint-Domingue. The enormous power that he wielded and his increasing autonomy from France's rule created some animosity with French leaders, especially one in particular who would wrest power through a coup d'etat in 1799. Under his rule, France would wage war against its wealthy sugar colony. In her memoirs, Joséphine wrote about her husband Napoleon Bonaparte's decision to send his army to Saint-Domingue, something she called a fatal move that would forever take this beautiful colony away from France. Keep Toussaint Louverture there. That is the man that you require in order to govern the blacks. It's an ominous quote, given what transpired afterward. It's hardly controversial to suggest that, had Louverture been allowed to govern on behalf of the French, it would have ended far better for them. Indeed, Louverture was hardly a radical. He emancipated the slaves, but he militarized plantation work, making it a crime to leave the plantations in which they were enslaved. The only difference now, really, was that they were wage slaves. Despite his wife's pleas, Napoleon Bonaparte could not stomach Louverture's bold constitution, which he signed in July of 1801, which he then sent to Napoleon directly. In naming himself Governor-General for life, Napoleon said, Toussaint knew very well that he had thrown away his mask and had drawn his sword out of its sheath forever. Though it's important to note with regard to the Haitian Revolution that in many ways and at various stages, calling it a racial war is somewhat reductive. Alliances were plenty and complicated. After all, Toussaint Louverture fought for Spain and France. as did thousands of other black rebels. It was Napoleon Bonaparte, however, who insisted on invoking race as his motivation. "Rid us of these gilded Negroes," Bonaparte wrote to his expedition leader Charles Leclerc in July 1802. "Disarm the blacks." It was him who called the fighting force a crusade of civilized people of the West against the black barbarism. Not to be misinterpreted, he clarified, "I am for the whites because I am white. I have no other reason, and that one is good." His expedition consisted of...
Isn't that funny? That is literally like, bro, this shit has never changed. Like, it's ridiculous that literally not a single aspect of this is changed at all. Like, same principles, same attitude, same fucking rhetoric, down to the civilizing of the barbarian. And I'm sure there were libtards at the time who were like, you know, maybe we should leave the black people alone. But we do have to civilize these barbarians a little bit, right? What about the white people? We have to defend the white people. What about the missionaries? Oh, they're just mad because we were taming them with our beautiful ways of existence in Christianity. It's like, that's what it really is about. They just don't like Christianity and the civilizing aspect of it, seemingly. Wow, they just want to do racial supremacy in the other direction. It's really fucked up when everyone can see racial supremacy work in only one direction.
Of some 50 ships, half of France's large naval vessels. Aboard them were 22,000 soldiers and 20,000 sailors. The total numbers sent to Saint-Domingue would balloon to upwards of 80,000 men. Toussaint Louverture, upon seeing the French Armada, rallied his own troops, perhaps as many as 30,000 by early 1802, aside from the local militias numbering in the thousands as well. After being fired on by black rebels in northern Saint-Domingue, near Le Cap, General Donatien Marie-Joseph de Rochambeau captured the garrison. Rochambeau had lost 60 men and made sure to exact revenge to make an example of the black troops and proceeded to massacre hundreds of them. Rochambeau was only debuting the French strategy, yet another war of extermination. However, the French yet again found themselves ill-prepared for the war waged against them by the Africans. The enemy held nowhere and yet never ceased to be the masters of the country. The French had made devastating progress in a short period of time. After capturing Le Cap, they wrested the northern peninsula from Louverture's forces, though they would take to the mountains and the wilderness, burning and sabotaging as they withdrew. Tear up the roads, throw corpses and horses into all the fountains, burn and annihilate everything, so that those who have come to return us to slavery will always find in front of them the image of the hell they deserve. Though Louverture was a shrewd military planner, he was perhaps eclipsed in harshness by his mysterious underling. In the port town of Saint-Marc, Jean-Jacques Dessalines led his troops by example, setting fire to his own recently completed mansion. Barrels of gunpowder and alcohol were placed throughout the town to aid a rapid flame. Dessalines also took hundreds of French prisoners, and by the time the French arrived to Saint-Marc's smoldering ruins, they also found hundreds of their own scattered throughout. Dessalines then embarked for Port-au-Prince, taking several hundred white prisoners. These included Michel de Courty, a physician kept along for his expertise, which the rebels doubtless thought that they could exploit. He would later write of the horror show that was life as a prisoner under Dessalines. By the time Dessalines had reached the mountains, he had very few white prisoners with him. Louverture questioned Dessalines, "What happened to all of your prisoners?" "Oh," said Dessalines, "they were killed in battle or escaped." But de Courty said otherwise. He said Dessalines slaughtered them by the hundreds. This was corroborated by General Pamphile Lacroix, who said he had found 800 corpses in Verret while pursuing Dessalines' retreating troops. This wasn't the only pile of bodies that he'd find. Seeking to spare his troops from the stench of one group of bodies piled up near their camp and lacking shovels to build a mass grave, he burned them. Instead of removing the odor, this move filled the air with an even more acrid smell, one he was never able to remove from his clothes.
Jesus fucking Christ.
As surprising as it may sound given the said gruesome details, mass killing was the least of the French army's worries. A more insidious problem plagued them: disease. The yellow fever appeared suddenly, causing sharp pains in the eye sockets, feet, loins, and stomach. A thick, whitish-yellow fluid covered the parched tongue, then the teeth, and soon changed into a black encrustation. The pulse became elevated, the regurgitations yellow from bile, the feces and urine red. He was already a corpse, putrid and horrible from the blood's decomposition. Deaths from disease apparently reached a massive 120 per day, owing to a miscalculation by Bonaparte. Thinking that the expedition would be a quick victory, he deployed them at the beginning of 1802. But the war grinded on. The looming summer months were steadily approaching, until the noxious epidemics ruptured from the earth. Still a prisoner of Dessalines, Descourtis recorded what are some of the only words of his that still survive to this day. "The whites from France cannot hold out against us here in Saint-Domingue. They will fight well at first, but soon they will fall sick and die like flies." Toussaint Louverture's fortunes would change in a most unexpected way. One of his most trusted allies, Henri Christophe, commander of the Northern Plain, surrendered to Leclerc. It wouldn't be long until Louverture did the same. Finding his position severely compromised, it was a massive betrayal. Louverture signed an agreement at Le Cap, where he would surrender in return for keeping his military rank and returning to his plantation at Annery. Leclerc had pardoned Toussaint, and the latter had pledged his loyalty to France. Leclerc had given his word of honor. It was a lie. Upon visiting the home of General Jean-Baptiste Brunet, General Leclerc entered, accompanied by a large number of soldiers who surrounded me, seized me, bound me as a criminal, and conducted me on board the frigate Créole. As he boarded the ship that would bring him to his exile, he exclaimed, "In overthrowing me, you have cut down, in Saint-Domingue, only the trunk of the tree of the liberty of the blacks. It will grow from the roots, because they are deep and numerous." Louverture withered away and finally died a year later in a freezing dungeon in France on April 7th, 1803. This would prove to be yet another miscalculation on the part of Napoleon, who had sealed the fate of the French. For Toussaint Louverture was merely replaced by his brutal partner, Jean-Jacques Dessalines.
I don't get it.
Unbeknownst to Leclerc, up to that.
Certainly there will be no Hamas too. These are solutions that require, these are problems that require military solutions. Surely the people do not have an unending yearning for freedom, as it is the natural predisposition of man to want to be rid of all of the chains that bind them. No. Certainly. Notice how originally simply substituting from chattel slavery to wage slavery was like most likely a comfortable middle ground of progress for many. And yet one side chose to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Think about that.
That point, since he believed Dessalines would be a valuable asset. Leclerc even sent him on a mission to disarm the population. However, after publicly confiscating arms, he covertly rearmed the population, all while stocking up on ammunition. Dessalines' belief that he would soon have to take up arms against the French once again was understandable. Indeed, when France reinstituted slavery in the island colony of Guadeloupe, news couldn't be contained for long. This fact confirmed everyone's suspicions of what the true plans were for Napoleon's officers. And sure enough, Dessalines attacked French troops in Gonaives, sending the soldiers into retreat to their ships in the harbor. He told them, "Return to Europe." Leclerc sought to rein in the black soldiers through genocide. "In order to control the mountains, once I have finally completed the job, I will have to destroy all the food crops and a large proportion of the cultivators. I will need to wage a war of extermination. Leclerc's target was the black population of Saint-Domingue, including those who fought in his ranks. In Le Cap, he had 1,000 colonial troops arrested, loaded onto ships, and pushed overboard with large sacks of flour tied around their necks. A contemporary witness, Jean-Pierre Bichot, corroborated the practice. Drowning is the usual way of putting to death black prisoners. I've been told that, on several occasions, thousands...
If there's one thing that always works in an enslaved population that withstood genocidal conditions, it's just more genocide. That seemingly also is a really successful strategy there, just like the military solution. And ultimately, seemingly most successful military solution is always going to be genocide. So
thousands were drowned at the same time, and their bodies were often seen floating. Like many unsuccessful campaigns against insurgencies, the rebels had cleverly utilized their many advantages: their fighting edge, their mastery of the wilderness and mountains, disease, sabotage, scorched earth, all to bleed the occupiers. This strategy worked. "Half of the officers in this army are dead," wrote Leclerc in summer 1802. "Men passed through and disappeared like shadows," recalled Lacroix. Armed with muskets, the rebels also scored casualties using tactics from the old slave rebellion days.
That's why I laugh whenever motherfuckers in the Western world try to portray themselves as like civilized, because this is no act of a civilized people. The act of enslaving an entire continent full of humans is already uncivilized as fuck.
They laid traps. Pits dug into the ground were covered with branches, leaves. On the bottom lay boards studded with nails. Rocks or tree limbs might be placed in front of them, prompting soldiers to jump over them, landing hard into the bed of nails. By 1803, Dessalines had effectively consolidated his power over most of the rebels in the colony. Under his command, he'd unify hundreds of local leaders, an astonishing feat, and with their help, they continued to bleed the French, and drove them out of most of the colony. Their coup d'éclat finally came in May, when peace between Britain and France fell through. No reinforcement would be coming for them now. A song from the period was passed down generation after generation, recording the march toward victory of Dessalines' troops. "Dessalines is leaving the north. Come see what he is bringing. He is bringing cannons to chase away the whites." In November, Dessalines directed a final attack on French positions outside Le Cap. On the 18th of the month,
I finally realized Hasan is basically the Tucker Carlson of the left. Shit would be so funny if it wasn't so sad. I mean, I want to thank you for saying that. Tucker Carlson is an incredibly successful propagandist for the white nationalist cause. If you mean that I'm an incredibly successful propagandist for socialism and the cause of educating Americans on socialism, and do a pretty good job of like explaining socialism, anti-imperialism, and the like through the framework that is easily digestible by liberals by utilizing mostly liberal language, then yeah, I'll take it. But I don't think you're saying that. I don't know if that's what you're trying to mean here. If you're watching a fucking, if you're watching a collection of historical facts laid out bare about the Haitian Revolution, and this triggers your sensibilities to such a degree that you have to call me the Tucker Carlson, I don't know what to tell you. I think it is you who needs to re-examine their principles.
month, Dessalines sat on a stone, holding his snuff box, and watched as his troops took the final, crucial hill, conquering a country, a nation for his entire race. Rochambeau at long last acquiesced and accepted defeat. After negotiating a surrender, several thousand troops, along with white residents of Le Cap, sailed out of the harbor. Behind them were some 50,000 dead. A majority of the soldiers and sailors who had been sent to Saint-Domingue had died. On New Year's Day of the year 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines now emperor,
Motherfuckers
declared independence.
Motherfuckers will play Red Dead 2 and still come in here and not recognize what's going on there. How insanely dumb do you have to be to compare Hasan to Tucker Carlson? I mean, I try to take something positive out of it. Tucker Carlson is a massive, massive piece of shit. He is a white nationalist. If he's coming here while I'm talking about the liberation of slaves in Haiti and saying that, maybe he doesn't have a angry approach, even though he doesn't follow me, so I would assume he is.
For the new nation of Haiti, thought to be the old Arawak name for the island. Among the declaration's words were the following ominous statements. Citizens, it is not enough to have expelled the barbarians who have bloodied our land for 2 centuries. It is not enough to have restrained those ever-evolving factions that one after another mocked the specter of liberty that France dangled before you. We must, with one last act of national authority, forever assure the empire of liberty in the country of our birth. We must take any hope of re-enslaving us away from the inhuman government that for so long kept us in the most humiliating torpor. In the end, we must live independent or die. When will we tire of breathing the air that they breathe? What do we have in common with this nation of executioners? The difference between its cruelty and our patient moderation, its color and ours, the great seas that separate us, our avenging climate, all tell us plainly that they are not our brothers, that they never will be, and that if they find refuge among us, they will plot again to trouble and divide us. These tigers, still dripping with their blood, whose terrible presence indicts your lack of feeling and your guilty slowness in avenging them, what are you waiting for before appeasing their spirits? What followed this proclamation is somewhat disputed. He ordered a series of massacres of white inhabitants.
Bro said kill the Yakubian devils, dude. He said if you're a child of Yakub, it is time to leave.
Although precisely how many perished is difficult to establish. Between February and May 1804, several thousand of the remaining French were systematically massacred in 2 waves, men first, women and children afterwards. It was then that the complete massacre took place. The population, stirred to fear at the nearness of the counter-revolution, killed all with every possible brutality. After the first slaughter, Dessalines issued a proclamation promising pardon to all who were in hiding. They came out and were immediately killed.
Uh-oh.
On April 28th, Dessalines himself...
Bro, how do you hide as a white person in Haiti post-revolution? Like, that part I don't even understand. It's like, the fuck were you thinking at that point? You know what I mean? Oh, they won't know. Like, what, you're doing... dude, is it blackface, actually?
Himself had issued a proclamation, which seemed to indicate that something significant had indeed occurred. Finally, the hour of vengeance has struck, and the implacable enemies of the rights of man have received the punishment their crimes deserved. Yes, we have rendered unto those true cannibals, war for war, crimes for crime, outrage for outrage. Yes, I have saved my country. I have avenged America.
So the events that unfolded in the entirety of the Haitian